Maria Montessori is an Italian physician and educator, born educated in Rome. Very unusually for the time, the end of the 19th century. She got a degree in engineering and a degree in medicine. The medical profession in Italy was not particularly accepting of women physicians at the time. And so the first assignment that she was given was to work with, to use the terminology of the time, mentally retarded children. And so she was given a number of them to look after. And essentially those children were warehoused. They were just put in a mostly dark room, no toys, no structured activities, and just left there. So what Montessori did was started to work with them, develop some educational materials. And the thing that brought her first to national attention was in 1901, her mentally retarded students took the test that was for normal children, and her mentally retarded children passed the test. And obviously this is a striking phenomenon. Mentally retarded children, not very much at all is expected of them. And so the implication here is that more is possible, more quality of life, more education for children with developmental problems or outright disabilities. And then also a further implication that if mentally retarded children, with whatever Montessori was doing with them, can pass the state-mandated test for normal children, what would be possible to normal children if we started to adapt and use Montessori methods with normal children. So at that point, she was offered a position with being able to work in the poor area of Rome with 50 or 60 children, and she opened her very first school, the Casa de Bambini, as it came to be called. Over the course then of the next decade, she developed a strong reputation in Italy, then in Europe, until the point where she was also heard of across the ocean in the United States. And at this point, there were some fireworks because the new method of philosophical education that Montessori was developing clashed with then prevailing schools dominated by pragmatism and what came to be called as progressivism, or a more politicized version of pragmatic philosophy. At that point, the big name in American pragmatic education was John Dewey. We've discussed him in an earlier lecture. And a former student of his named William Hurd Kilpatrick, who was now a colleague, and Kilpatrick was to become one of the major progressive educators of the 20th century. In 1914, Kilpatrick wrote a very critical monograph on Montessori education, and the effect of that monograph, once it was read by the education establishment, was effectively to shut Montessori out of formal public education in the United States for most of the 20th century. So what happened in the case of Montessori, of course, was she continued to develop her school successfully in Europe and in the United States. But in the United States in particular, it was a mostly grassroots, parent-led initiative until toward the end of the 20th century, there began to be a resurgence, right, of interest in Montessori in the formal public schooling establishment as well. And by the time we now get into the 21st century, Montessori education does seem to be a major contender and here to stay. So what I want to do is talk through some of the major elements, major ingredients in Montessori education, what makes it distinctive. And my methodology here will simply be to identify the point, say a little bit about it, and then give you a quotation from Montessori herself. At the end of that discussion, what we'll want to do is wrap up the themes. I'll put them on the board. We'll go over to the whiteboard. And then I want to try to make some connections philosophically to Objectivism as a philosophical system. The first point that Montessori makes is that, particularly at the turn of the 20th century, education has been largely a matter of a prior set of understandings of what education should be, and taking children and fitting them into the education system. In many cases, children are seen as just simply small adults, and we take the adult framework and expect children to fit into the adult framework no matter what age they are. Now, earlier theorists such as John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and others had emphasized the developmental issues and the importance of recasting the education system to fit the child. And Montessori certainly takes this theme and runs strongly with it, that what we need to do is recast the education system to be child-centered, that children have their own developmental developmental needs, they have certain capacities, and then what we need to do is understand the child as a developing human being and craft the educational system around our best scientific understanding of what children are. So here's a quotation from Montessori from a 1936 work, quote, "The adult has not understood the child or the adolescent and is therefore in continual strife with him. The remedy is not that the adult should learn something intellectually or complete a deficient culture. He must find a different starting point. In their dealings with children, adults look upon the child as something empty, right, that is to be filled through their own efforts, as something inert and helpless for which they must do everything, as something lacking an inner guide, right, and in constant need of direction. But if a child has within himself the key to his own personality, these must be delicate powers indeed, and an adult by his untimely interventions can prevent their secret realization." Unquote. So the point here is that we should not take grown adults with their expectations, values, knowledge, framework, and so forth, and impose them upon the child. Instead, we see each child as an individual, and as an individual with developmental, right, potential, right, that all we need to do is recognize what that potential is and shape what we're doing in schools and educational practices around the child's developmental needs. Now, this does require some change of the formal environment. For example, if we say that each child is a little bit different, we're not going to have one-size-fits-all classroom. If we say that children have their own developmental stages, right, then we're not, for example, going to use adult equipment and adult furniture. For example, Montessori, this is all fairly common now in the 20th century and 21st century, but Montessori was a pioneer, for example, in arguing that classrooms should be stocked with child-sized furniture, child-sized chairs, child-sized tables, desks, and so forth, that fit the child's body, but also that are able to be moved by the children themselves to suit whatever it is that they are working on. Now, there is nonetheless a strong role for parents and teachers in preparing the environment, right, in which students will do their own learning and their own developing. The adults are experts, and they do in general form know what children need in order to develop into competent adults. And so parents and teachers do need to pay some attention to the school and preparing the kinds of materials that children then will more independently be able to operate on. And so Montessori is a strong believer in a great variety of prepared materials focused on different kinds of knowledge, concepts that children need to be able to acquire, pieces of knowledge, hypotheses that children will want to be able to test and explore, skills that they will need to acquire, and so forth. So, for example, one kind of prepared material is called manipulatives. And Montessori was a very strong advocate of children having available to them materials that they would be able to use with their hands, that is to say, strictly manipulate. And in the act of manipulating them, there would be a built-in structure for how properly to manipulate them. So let me give you some examples. If we're interested in children learning about lengths and volumes and sizes, right, for example, one example would be a series of rods, say all painted brown, so we just take the color issue out of the equation. We're not interested in color. We want the children to attend to length, and each of the rods is of different lengths. Now, the way Montessori would do it is have a whole series of rods. Say the first piece is 1 centimeter in length, and the next piece is 10 centimeters in length, and so forth in various stages. And then all of these rods would be in a little kit. The children would take all of the rods out, but then from playing around with it and manipulating the rods, would then start to place the rods in order. Here's the shortest one, here's the one that's the next in size, here's the ones that next in size, right, and so forth. And then the child then is by himself learning about lengths. Or with respect to volumes, say another example would be the pink tower, where it's a whole series of cubes, all of them pink. The uniform color is, again, we're not attending to color issues. Instead, we want the child to focus on volume. And so the first one will, say, be a cube that is 1 centimeter width, length, and height. The next one will be another dimension up, another dimension up, another dimension up. And then what the child can then do is learn how to take the largest of the cubes, place the next largest one, the next largest one, the next largest one, on and so forth. Now, the point of all of these is that Montessori's manipulatives are training the child to work with his or her hands, work with their eyes. And so the importance here is on sensory training, sensory observation. But on the basis of the sensory observation, the child then is forming concepts. And so what we have is conceptual abstractions about size and length and so forth are built into sensory material. And so abstract concepts that we come to form, in this case it will be more geometric and mathematical concepts, nonetheless always have a perceptual basis. And so it's a point of abstractions, right, being tied to sensory perceptual data. Another example I think of is when children are a little bit older and we're preparing them to learn to write. Of course, we know that manual dexterity and being able to hold, say, a small pencil is somewhat difficult. And so sometimes we might introduce by having pencils with thicker shafts and so forth. But one method that Montessori mentioned or introduced when children are learning the alphabet is to have oversized letters on sheets of paper, but the letter would be cut out of very fine sandpaper and then pasted onto a sheet of paper. And then the child will then, with his or her finger, trace out the letter. And so the child with larger macroscopic movements can get the sense of the shape of the letter. I'm doing a C here, but then there would also be a K, right, and so forth. And on the basis of that, the abstract symbols, right, that each of the letters represent is embedded, right, in a set of motor activities that are sensorially based. So again, we have abstractions tied to sensory data. Another element of the manipulatives that was unique to Montessori is the building in of assessment, or building assessment rather, right into the sensory materials. Normally, right, when we have children doing things in traditional schools, the children work on a project. That project is passed off to a teacher. The teacher marks what the student did correctly and incorrectly, and then the feedback is given back to the students. What Montessori emphasizes as much as possible is taking the teacher out of the assessment equation. So for example, if we want children to learn lengths or volumes, in the case of the pink tower or the different lengths of the rods, the materials themselves enable the child to assess whether he is doing them correctly or incorrectly. So for example, if we are taking the pink cubes, it is obvious to the child perceptually if he has tried a certain arrangement of the cubes but then has one cube left over and it's too small to go on the cube that's at the top because that cube is already smaller. The child then is in a position using his or her own judgment to see where approximately that cube should go to deconstruct a tower and to retry it again until he can see for himself that all of the cubes rather are in a developmental order all the way up to the top. And the same thing with the rods of varying lengths, right? He can see for himself once he has tried a certain arrangement if the rods do follow the sequence from shortest to longest and so forth. So the point here is that we want to be teaching students to have their own independent judgment about what the nature of reality is and what features are and how things properly can be arranged, as opposed to being required to depend on teachers telling them whether they got things right or wrong. Now, another important point about the use of manipulatives is another theme that runs through all of Montessori education is the importance of integrating cognition, that we want students to learn certain abstract lessons. We want them to develop their perceptual capacities, their intellectual capacities, right, and so forth. That for Montessori, this is not a purely mental activity or a purely intellectual activity. Instead, cognition and movement are integrated for her. That for her, this is a common phrase that for us now, right, a century later, largely due to the influence of Montessori, that cognition is integrated with movement, right? We are mind-body integrates, and our minds work best to the extent that the things that we are learning are integrated with our bodily movements, with our practices. So I have a quotation here, quote, "One of the greatest mistakes of our day is to think of movement by itself as something apart from the higher functions. Mental development must be connected with movement and be dependent on it. It is vital that education theory and practice should become informed by this idea. Watching a child makes it obvious that the development of the mind comes about through his movements. Mind and movements are part of the same entity. All right, moving on. Another prominent feature of Montessori education is its emphasis on choice. Of course, we know that much of traditional education is a matter of students being assigned by teachers various projects and all students doing the same thing more or less at the same time, taking the same tests and being required to do things at the same way. What Montessori education does almost uniquely is have a prior environment, right, prepared environment where there are lots of activities that are open to students. And students, as they come in to begin the school day, each student individually is able to make his or her own choices about what projects he or she is going to work upon. So for Montessori, this notion of having a sense of control, right, over our own life is a very important theme to her, and this needs to be built into the education process. Here is a quotation. Quote, "These children," that is to say the children in her schools, "have free choice all day long. Life is based on choice, so they learn to make their own decisions. They must decide and choose for themselves all the time. They cannot learn through obedience to the commands of another." Now, there are 2 points here. One is certainly a point about the social structure of a classroom. Montessori is very anti-authoritarian, anti-obedience, anti-top-down social structure, and certainly this has broader social and political implications. But she's making a point here about human nature, that each of us likes to be the master of our own destiny, and this is a feature of human nature right from the beginning, right, with children. And so the point is that children are going to learn best, and they're going to realize themselves as human beings to the extent that we respect their ability to make choices. Now, in a school setting, of course, we want to make sure that they are learning and exposed to important stuff, but that is the point about the prepared environment that the teachers and parents will prepare right ahead of time for the students, so that all of the interesting activities that children can choose from, all of those are activities that will have important educational themes built into them for the children to explore. Another element of the importance of choice for Montessori is that each of us is unique as individuals. We all have our own interests, our all focuses, and we all develop at differing rates. And so rather than the uniformity that much traditional schooling requires of students being imposed, instead students are able to pursue their own interests. So one student, for example, might be very interested in the different mathematical products, so working with the rods of different lengths, the cubes of different volumes, and so forth, and very, very intensely interested in mathematical or geometrical and arithmetic issues. And so that student can, as much as possible, in the time available to him, work on those issues, while another student who might be very interested in reading, say reading about animals, can devote a significant amount of time to learning about biology, about animals, and developing his or her reading skills. So there's no necessity in Montessori that all students' interests be jammed into a Procrustean bed, whether the student is interested or not. So this enables us to respect the individuality, right, of students as much as possible. A related point about motivation here is that motivation obviously is not imposed on the students. Instead, the motivation to work on a given thing comes from the student. I am interested in reading a story about animals. And so Montessori's point is that students will learn more and their concentration will be more focused for longer periods of time if they are intrinsically interested, as demonstrated by the choice that they have made to pursue a given line of knowledge here as well. And what this means is that Montessori, in her system of education, frowns upon using extrinsic rewards, things like grades, right, or monies, or even gold stars. The idea being here that what we want is for students to choose things that they are interested in and learn things because they want to learn those things. If they are learning to read because they think they're going to get a gold star, well, of course, that has some effectiveness in getting them to learn how to read, right? Or if they think they're going to get praise, then really they are learning it to get the gold star or to get the praise. And Montessori, in her judgment, thinks that students don't learn as well, and certainly they don't retain the material as well if they're not intrinsically motivated, rather if they are extrinsically motivated. Quote, "The prize and the punishment are incentives, but towards unnatural and forced effort. And therefore we certainly cannot speak of the natural development of the child in connection with them." And a different quote, "The secret of success is found to lie in the right use of imagination, in awakening interest, and the stimulation of seeds already sown." So again, internal motivation, right, intrinsic rewards to learning as opposed to external motivation and rewards. All right, this is part of a broader thesis of self-direction, that the important thing in life is by the time we are adults, we need to be self-directed in all of the major areas of life, and so Montessori wants to build that right into education. And so students are going to be ideally self-directed learners with a minimal amount of adult input and a direct supervision, minimal guidance and so forth. Teachers and parents, of course, do know a lot and can properly guide. We'll talk about their role a little more systematically later here. But the emphasis is on that primary kind of responsibility or initiative that we all need as human beings of learning for ourselves and so forth. Quote, "By leaving the children in our schools at liberty, right, we have been with great clearness to follow them in their natural method of spontaneous self-development." We all naturally have a drive to grow, to learn, to explore, to be curious, to become better in knowledge and so forth. And so to the extent that the education system sets itself up to tap into that and encourage, and in some cases direct that, we will maximize human potential. Very optimistic quotation here from Montessori, quote, "All we have to do is set the energy free." When we speak of the freedom in education, we mean the freedom for the creative energy, which is the urge of life toward the development of the individual. This is not the casual energy like the energy of a bomb that explodes. It has a guiding principle, a very fine but unconscious directive, the aim of which is to develop a normal person. When we speak of free children, we are thinking of this energy, which must be free in order to construct these children well, unquote. A few more related points about the self-directed nature of education in the Montessori system and the individuality of the choices and the respecting the uniqueness of each individual child. One is that when a child chooses to work on a given project, the child has his or her own space within to work, and other children then are taught to respect that child's space as he or she is working on a given project, just as when those children have chosen the projects that they're going to work on, they are given a space, and the other children are taught rather to respect that particular space. So for example, if I am working with the pink cubes or the rods of different lengths or my sandpaper letters and I'm tracing them out, I will, one example would be have my own little area rug, and each child will have his or her own rug, and I will lay my rug out at a certain place, and that will be my space, my property, right, so to speak. I'll put my materials on it, and other children learn to respect my working on my space. Or if I'm working on a book, I've chosen a comfortable chair. That becomes my comfortable chair and my space while I'm doing my reading of my animal stories and so forth. Another related point about the self-direction is that children are not assigned set blocks of time. So it's not the case that you've got 25 minutes to work on the blocks or 40 minutes to read a given story and so forth. Children are also in the Montessori system able to work on a project for as long as they judge appropriate or until they feel they have achieved mastery or sufficient mastery of the project, right, whatever it happens to be. Now Montessori would say ideally we set aside 3-hour blocks of time, a 3-hour block in the morning, a 3-hour block in the afternoon. And so in principle, a child could work on a given project for, say, up to 3 hours if he or she wants to spend that amount of time on a project, or he or she could work on several projects if he or she is able to master any number of projects in the 3-hour right chunk of time. But again, the point here is that we don't have adults dictating to the children that they have to learn according to this schedule, or if they haven't learned it by that time, too bad, it's time to move on to the next thing. Instead, the important thing is that the child actually learn to master the given project, and the child is given however much time he or she needs in order to achieve it. Another point about self-directed learning that ties into adult life is that children are responsible once they're finished with working with a given project and its materials to clean it up and put those materials away. So the tray that the pink blocks, for example, come in once I've figured out to my satisfaction how to stack the blocks, and I want to move on to the next thing. Before I move on to the next thing, I take the blocks down, I put them back in the tray, and I take the tray back over to the shelves and put it away. So we're teaching children here self-responsibility. They make the choice, they do the project, and then they clean up and put away afterwards as well. It also applies to other life skills that we will have children learn in a Montessori school, and that ties into the next point. That for Montessori, everything that we learn as children should be a piece of knowledge, a skill, the acquisition of a habit that is meaningful to us by the time we will become adults, but it's also got to be meaningfully understood to the child in the child's context. And so that what we are doing is not what often happens in traditional schools, is asking children to take things on faith, right? That you need to learn this for your own good, but we can't really explain to you why you need to learn it. Just take it on faith that at some point 15 or 20 years later down the road, you are going to need this knowledge. Instead, for Montessori, what the children need to learn is embedded in meaningful context, but the meaningfulness is at the child's level of understanding, the child's level of interest. So for example, if we take young children, one of the important pieces of knowledge that we need to learn is how to dress ourselves. And of course, clothing is somewhat complicated. My clothing has buttons, for example. It has zippers. It might have laces that need to be tied up and so forth. And so Montessori will have prepared manipulatives, say trays that have zippers on them, buttons on them, and so forth, and children can work on those particular manipulatives, learning how to button and unbutton, how to close a zipper, the different pressures and angles and so forth, the repeated trial and error of learning how to tie a bow and so on. And all of these things are meaningful to the children because as parents we are encouraging them to learn how to dress themselves, and they need to learn all of those particular skills. So one other thing that would be a meaningful thing is learning to feed ourselves, to prepare simple meals at home and of course in school. Children need snacks. They need to have lunchtime typically during the course of the day, and Montessori education will build in those practical life skills. How do we store food? Some of it stays in the refrigerator, some of it goes in cupboards. Here are the plates and utensils and glasses and so forth that we need, and the children take responsibility for preparing their own snacks, right, and meals, feeding themselves, learning how to use the cutlery, how to use napkins and so forth. And then at the end of the recess, at the end of the meal, responsible for putting all of the leftover materials away. Some go in the fridge, some go in the cupboards. The utensils need washing, the plates need washing, drying, and then they're put in the cupboards as well. Or in more outside of the school classrooms, we want to learn real life skills. We might take children regularly on field trips to farms. Some Montessori schools will build in simplified farms or have the school actually at a working farm as well. So children learn about caring for other animals, feeding chickens, harvesting the eggs, and so forth. And again, these are all skills that are important. We learn about the food chain and other animals, caring for them, and so forth. Quotation here. Education, and this is a critical quotation, right, initially from Montessori's perspective, quote, education as today conceived is something separated both from biological and social life. All who enter the educational world tend to be cut off from society. People are prepared for life by exclusion from it, unquote. And that's a problem for Montessori. So as much as possible, Montessori wants to bring the real world into the classroom and have the real world be the classroom so that from the child's context, he or she can make those meaningful connections from the things that he or she is learning to what goes on in real life in all of its manifestations. All right, a natural question comes up about being social in a Montessori context, because so far all of the themes that we have stressed have been highly individualistic, and Montessori education education is fundamentally an individualistic mode of education. We emphasize individual choice. We emphasize that each of us is unique in our interests, that we're unique in our individual rates of mastery of materials, right, and so forth. We emphasize respecting people's space when they're working on projects and so forth. What about the social element? Well, Montessori argues that we are naturally social creatures, but the sociability is not something that needs to be forced, that rather it will naturally develop. That children do like to play with each other, they do like to learn from each other, and while she does think there are different developmental stages, sometimes we are more social and sometimes we are less social, that children will naturally form social groupings in the school. So for example, one of the things that is common in Montessori schools is to have a wider age groupings of students. So children from, say, ages 3 to 5 will be in the same classroom, or from ages 6 to 8 and so forth, as opposed to a more traditional arrangement where we just have 6-year-olds together, 7-year-olds together, and so forth. And one of the things that will happen, she will point out, is that younger students will notice older students working on something and their interest will be piqued by it. And so they will go up to the older student and hopefully respectfully learn how to ask a question. What are you working on? That's interesting. How did you do that? And that the older student will then show the younger student what he or she is doing. Or two students will both be interested in working on a given thing, but they will get a certain amount of pleasure from working on it together, and that certainly is optional. And so spontaneously, students will voluntarily choose various kinds of social groupings and so forth. Here's a quotation. Quote, "Our schools show that children of different ages help one another. The younger ones see what the older ones are doing and ask for explanations. These are readily given, and the instruction is really valuable. The older ones are happy to be able to teach what they know. People sometimes fear that if a child of 5 gives lessons, this will hold him back from his own progress. But in the first place, he does not teach all the time, and his freedom is respected. Second, teaching helps him to understand what he knows even better than before. He has to analyze and rearrange his little store of knowledge before he can pass it on. So everyone achieves a healthy normality through the mutual exchange." So individuality is respected, but students will voluntarily form social groupings that are mutually beneficial to each of them. And if we're interested in broader social concerns, and Montessori certainly was active in issues of peace and the big problems during the 20th century about the continual strife between nations, the various world wars, and so forth. A lot of that, she thinks, comes out of misappropriated or bad education, misallocated childlike energy, and the stifling of natural human influences. So if we really are interested in social cooperation and teaching people to get along with each other, her kind of education system, she thinks, is extraordinarily valuable. One quotation from a 1965 work, quote, "Schools can make a contribution to the cause of goodness by removing obstacles." So respecting students' freedoms rather than putting obstacles in their way to their normal natural development will enable us to develop more healthy human beings as opposed to frustrated and in some cases neurotic individuals, and that will have long-term social benefits as well. All right, we've not said a whole lot yet about teachers. We did say something about the role of teachers in preparing the initial environment and having all of the projects and manipulatives available that students are able to work upon. And that point is certainly iterated and reiterated by Montessori a lot. That the most work teachers will do is the work ahead of the child actually arriving in the classroom in preparing all of the materials in a way that is going to be useful to the children once the children arrive. And one of the phrases that she uses here is obviously the children are going to have lots of freedom once they arrive, but it will be in a structured environment. And that is the slogan quotation here, quote, "Freedom in a structured environment," right, unquote. And a different quotation, quote, "The children in our schools are free, but that does not mean there is no organization," right? Organization is in fact necessary. if the children are to be free to work. So it's not just a matter of throwing children into an unstructured chaos and expecting them to sort it out. Instead, there's high structure built into all of the prepared materials, and so the students are put into a structured environment, and then they are free to explore. The teacher, another way Montessori puts it here, is once the students are in the classroom and working on the materials, plays the role of a guide, right, or sometimes a facilitator. Learning is primarily a student responsibility, but we all can learn from other people. We all need advice. We all need little tips, and collaboration is very useful. And the teacher, obviously, as an adult, mature, knowledgeable person, can collaborate in limited ways, right, with the child. Quote, "It is true that the child develops in his environment through activity itself, but he needs material means, guidance, and an indispensable understanding." By that she means the teacher. "It is the adult who provides these necessities. If the adult does less than is necessary, the child cannot act meaningfully, and if he does more than is necessary, he imposes himself on the child, extinguishing creative impulses." So there's an ongoing judgment call about when to step in to help out the child, but not stepping in only to the point where the child is then in a position to carry on working by himself, as opposed to doing the child's work for him and teaching the child to depend on adults to give him the right answers and so forth. And one other element about the role of the teacher is Montessori sometimes uses the metaphor of a policeman, that the teacher is also a policeman in addition to preparing the structured environment and being a guide, right, occasionally. There's a lot of freedom, obviously in a Montessori classroom, and so some children, of course, don't know how to handle their freedom. They'll do all kinds of crazy, childish kinds of things. They'll interfere with each other. Sometimes they will do things that are risky and dangerous to their physical health and so forth. And Montessori does say that part of the teacher's responsibility is, as a good policeman will do, keep track of those things and intervene on grounds of safety when appropriate. So, quote, "Do not apply the rule of non-interference when the children are still the prey of all their different naughtinesses. Do not let them climb on the windows, the furniture, etc. You must interfere at this stage. At this stage, the teacher must be a policeman. The policeman has to defend the honest citizens against the disturbers." So again, that's the end of the quote. Freedom within a structured environment, and teachers are responsible for the structure, but within that structured environment, it's a relatively laissez-faire classroom. Now, putting all of these points here about the design of the education system as a whole, Montessori argues that her system is a scientific system that's based on her own observations, and of course, drawing on the experience of many teachers and education theorists, right, in practice, but that she wants to take the scientific education of education up to a higher level. Obviously, medical science in the 1800s had progressed dramatically. Human psychology is much more complicated and was still in its infancy during Montessori's lifestyle. But her point was that we need to insist on scientific rigor as much as possible in understanding human psychology and the applied psychology that is human education, as much as we apply scientific rigor to the understanding of what is healthy for the body. Quote, "Scientific pedagogy," unquote, is the frame, actually was a subtitle to a book she wrote called The Montessori Method. All right, we'll pause there and go now to the board in a summary fashion.